I'm going to go on to my next topic.
Do you want to be in my pirate radio station, Bob?
Maybe if you're good.
I'll give you 3 o'clock in the morning and then people will be asleep by 5 past.
I'll give you if you are good.
I'm always good, Bob, all the time.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about a comment made by Dr. Yasir Qadhi. Dr. Yasir Qadhi is a famous Muslim Sunni scholar, and he has said this week in a 1 hour and 40-minute interview, he just stated the following. He stated, bear with us.
Spit it out.
So I'll just read from an article which reads as follows. Dr. Qadhi admitted at about 1 hour and 40 minutes into the program, one of the interviewers named Roxana Ivani asked Dr. Qadhi what the Salafist position would do with those latest historical difficulties surrounding who compiled what about Muhammad and the sayings of his in the Hadith, in the Sirah and the Tafsir, the Takriq, in the Islamic traditions. Dr. Qadhi admitted that this was a difficult question to answer, especially a man in his position, because he belonged to 2 camps which are debating this very problem, which created a kind of schizophrenic problem for him. And this is what he said. He said that between the Islamic science of Hadiths and the Western academic historical method, there is no commonality, ladies and gentlemen. Now I want to explain to you a little bit about what he was talking about. Here's what he's talking about. So Muslims use a series of literature called Hadiths and Sirat literature to talk about what Muhammad did, what Muhammad said, and what Muhammad permitted, and about his life in general. However, ladies and gentlemen, that literature in its entirety is dismissed by Western historians as not being sufficient as a source about Muhammad's life. Now, I'm going to explain why Western historical method does not believe in the methodology that is used by Islam. So the first methodology used by Islam is called the Isnad chain. And that's the idea that you have a chain of names in which one person told the next person, who told the next person, who told the next person, who told the next person what Muhammad did, what Muhammad said, or what Muhammad permitted. I invite you to just use up this space. Use up this space, ladies and gentlemen. No. Western historians reject this Isnad chain for the following reasons. They reject it because There is no external verification. In Western historiography, when you have a claim, what you're looking for is some kind of external attestation given by contemporaries, either in manuscripts or inscriptions or corroborating reports that would show that the Isnad chain is a real and legitimate chain. However, the Isnad chains of Islam rely entirely on internal consistency. There's no external verification for any Isnad chain. They are literally using their own sources to confirm their own sources without any reference to anything outside. So in other words, we don't have outside literature talking about any of the people in the Isnad chains. Secondly, most importantly, the Isnad chains are post-event constructs. In other words, they are made after the fact. They are post hoc inventions. The Isnad itself is an event that's constructed, and it starts to appear 2 centuries after the time that they're supposed to be talking about. So these lists of names started to be written down centuries after Muhammad died, ladies and gentlemen. Furthermore, the Isnad chains lack early manuscript evidence, despite the fact that Muslims like to boast about a complicated science of hadiths. They don't have contemporary documentation. Brother, do us a favour. Just ignore him. Just ignore him, or go and talk to him. I've got one. Do us a favour. Little Bob, stop. Billy, please, just ignore him. Please ignore him. Right? If you really want to help me, just stand in front of him. Right? So, ladies and gentlemen, lack of early manuscript evidence. Despite the elaborate Isnad science, they lack contemporary documents showing their transmissions. The earliest physical manuscript evidence for Bukhari and Muslim date from the 9th and 10th centuries. Muhammad died in the 7th century. Any questions on that point before I move on? Any questions on that point before I move on? Okay. The next point, ladies and gentlemen, about hadith literature is that Muslims rely on something called adala, which is the idea of the moral uprightness of the men and the women. Well, it's all men, by the way, except for Aisha and a few others. It's basically all men. It relies on the moral uprightness of those in the Isnad chain. The Islamic approach is to say that if a certain person is said to have moral uprightness, they can be trusted to report accurately about what went on. But there's huge amounts of problems with that. Firstly, it is entirely subjective. Sunni and Shia and Ibadi and Sufi all disagree about which people have moral uprightness. They don't agree. So how can any of us trust any of their chains? Secondly, even if you were morally upright, how does that equate to good memory? How does that equate to the fact that you remember reliably? These two things are not the same. How does that guarantee that you don't state a lie by accident, in error, and you merely believe that it is true even though it is not? Secondly, there's no testing mechanism available to judge the moral uprightness of anyone in an isnad chain. In fact, the very evidence used to support the moral uprightness of a hadith reporter is from the very hadiths that they report. How many of you go about slagging yourself off every day? It's not something you do. How many of you, if you were caught up in an argument that relied on people trusting you, would say, oh, by the way, I'm a sinner? Ladies and gentlemen, there are no ways to test the moral uprightness of anyone in the isnad chain. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, trust in the isnad chains that verifies the hadiths is an entirely circular logic. Any questions on that before I move on to my next point? Any questions on that point before I move on to my next point? Okay, the third aspect that Muslims think guarantees their isnad chains is what they call lika. Lika is the idea that two people in the chain actually met and were contemporaries of one another. But the massive problem with that, and this is what Muslim scholars don't tell Muslims, and it's what Muslim da'i never tell any of us, is that in their methodology, possibility equals reality. In other words, they take it for granted that if two people could have met, that means that they did in fact meet. Now, anyone with a brain can immediately see how ridiculously stupid the assumption of Imam Bukhari was. And this assumption has been adopted by Muslims at large. Just because two people lived in a city does not mean that they actually spoke to one another. And even if they spoke to one another, it does not mean that they spoke about the thing that the person claims that they heard from the other person. These are giant assumptions made in isnad logic. Furthermore, there is no isnad chain preserved in the document evidence. There's no list of names that gets bigger and bigger down through the centuries. There's no synoptic lists that we can put next to one another to see that how they were growing down through the centuries. And even if maybe there is a fragment of something somewhere, it by no means covers the entire corpus. And to that fact, let me ask this question. Muslims believe that their guided caliphs compiled the Quran because the Quran was in danger of being lost as a transmission at the time of Uthman, when Muslims were on the borders to invade Christian Armenia. And to secure it, Uthman came out with a revised Quran, a revised edition of the Quran. If the Hadiths were so important to Islamic doctrine, why was there no effort, no systematic effort to compile the Hadiths when they are a much larger corpus until nearly 200 years after Muhammad's death? That tells us that the value of Hadiths within Islamic doctrine grew over those 200 years. It elevated itself over those 200 years, and that in original proto-Islam they were not as valued. Now, the next problem is the matin of the Hadiths. That, for those of you that don't know, is the substance content of the Hadiths. So, it's the main text. It's talking about that Muhammad actually did. However, we know that Hadith reports evolved. Why did they evolve? What were the pressures that led to their evolution? The first pressure was sectarian differences between Muslims themselves. Shia and Sunni argued over pretty much everything, and still do. And each group created hadiths to support their position. Secondly, was divisions and differences between and within different Muslim communities. If you look at the four madhabs of classical Islam that have survived into the current time, they disagree on just about everything. And each of them refer to hadiths to support their position. And so, ladies and gentlemen, these disagreements led to the creation of fictional hadiths. And there were theological and Sharia fiqh based reasons for the creation of hadiths. And the system to filter fake from real hadiths came too late. It came 200 years too late, because Sunnis and Shias split in the 7th century, but the science of hadith was not canonized until the 9th and 10th century. And the madhabs, with all their peculiar arguments, had already formed with their different methodologies of fiqh, which is the methodology of deciding Sharia law. They'd already formed before the 10th century. And so the science for filtering fake from real hadith, fake from da'if, came too late to guarantee that the current corpus of hadith is not actually penetrated completely with fictions and lies. Furthermore, there's no awareness of the redaction layers of hadith. So, for example, the Western historian on Islam, G.H.A. Junbol and Harold Motsky, showed that hadiths were often the subject of gradual development, with isnads added retrospectively. When you look at Bukhari and Muslim and their method, they tried to reconstruct earlier form. There was no attempt by those imams to reconstruct earlier forms of the hadiths. And so, layers and modulations of hadith stories developed and were included in the hadith literature. Any questions on that point before I move on to my next point? Yes. Yes. The reason why so few women are involved in the telling of the story of Muhammad in the Isnad chains is because Muhammad said in his hadith that women were deficient in their religion. He said that their intellect was only worth half that of a man. He said that the testimony of a woman was only worth half that of a man. Now, the exceptions were given to women who were directly associated to Muhammad. Why? Because of that association. So there are thousands of hadith connected to Aisha, but there are not countless women in the Isnad chain going from Aisha. What? Did Aisha not have girlfriends? Did she not talk to other women? Aren't those women competent to remember those stories? Why is it goes Aisha, man, 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 man? Why? Because under Islamic Sharia law, the witness of a woman is worth half that of a man. So you would need two women to testify to every story that one man could testify to in the hadith. That's why if a woman is raped under Sharia law, she needs 4 female witnesses to justify in a Sharia court that she has actually been raped. This is how backward Islam is. By comparison, if you read the Gospels, the very first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ were women. And the entire Christian faith begins with the witness of women, ladies and gentlemen. And that is despite the fact that in that time and period in Jewish culture, the witness of a woman counted for nothing at all. But in the Christian community, because we raised women up to equal dignity of men, that the entire witness of men is equal to that of women. And so the faith of Christianity is born of the witness of women.
But I have a right to
Any other questions on this topic?
No, not a question, but something to say on Aisha.
Yeah.
That's one hadith that I do believe, where she doubts the Prophet Muhammad's.
Why doesn't the church pay taxes?
Where she says, "Your Lord hastens."
Why don't you pay taxes?
Yes.
Himself.
Look how big your belly is.
Now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen. Let's be clear. I am not stood here saying that every story about Muhammad is false. I believe that there probably are some true stories where, for instance, there is corroboration between the Quran and the Hadith. And I mean direct corroboration, not tangential corroboration. I believe that there was a living tradition around Muhammad that probably did survive, though malformed, into the present. But I say to you that even the embarrassing stories about Muhammad were probably made by Christian converts to Islam or Zoroastrian converts to Islam who did it under duress and resented their conversion. And thus they started embarrassing hadiths about Muhammad, attached it to believed isnad chains, popularized it, and then some scholar, because it helped them to look all scholarly, started talking about it because the science of hadith is pointless and useless.
Well, why are you so violent?
So,
Why did your friend...
ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen,
Forget about this.
I'll move on to the next point. Even your girlfriend is asking you to shut up. Even your girlfriend is asking you to behave like a man and not a child, so she doesn't have to be stood next to an emotional toddler. You are embarrassing your woman. Have some damn self-respect.
Aren't you emotional?
Now, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me, bro. Every day of the week, I am 3 times the man that you will ever be.
How'd you know that?
Now, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't mock children getting raped. You do. Now, let's go on. Let's go on, ladies and gentlemen. This next point is quite damning of the Islamic method. Muslims use a process called ijma. Now, ijma on paper means the consensus of the Muslim community. But ever aware of a bad idea in Islam and the Quran and the Hadith, the scholars of Islam have bravely stepped forward to give their interpretation of ijma as not being the consensus of the Muslim community, but the consensus of the scholarly Muslim community. Which raises the obvious question, whose scholars? The scholars of the Salafi, the scholars of the Ash'ari, the scholars of the Sufi, the scholars of the Ismaili, the scholars of the Ahmadiyya, the scholars of the Abadi. Whose scholars are we supposed to trust? Like, whose hadith chains are we supposed to trust? Whose hadiths are we supposed to trust? It's a completely subjective criterion, and it simply depends in which tradition you were brought up. However, consensus is hardly ever evident. Go and look at the madhabs like I have. Look at any question and virtually they'll disagree. They'll disagree on just about everything.
That's why religion is flawed.
And then those disagreements get even worse when you look at the different sects of Islam.
But Christianity's got the
They
very problem.
disagree on their doctrines. They disagree on their practices. They disagree on all of these things, showing that there is no ijma. There is no consensus, ladies and gentlemen. Furthermore, consensus is not equal to independent verification. Independent verification is always better than consensus. We know, as people practiced in democracy, that groups can agree upon bad ideas. Don't believe me? Look at Nazi Germany. Groups can agree upon error, and we can look at Islamic tradition and see that Muslims change their mind. If you compare the Sirat autobiographical literature of early Islam that predates the Hadiths of Imam Bukhari and Muslim, those early Sirat literature is on the whole rejected, even though it's an earlier source. In other words, the later historical records of Hadith outrank the biographies of the Sirah, even though the stories of the Sirah and the stories of the Hadith supposedly arrived in the same way, people remembering. And that decision was made because later generations found earlier reports embarrassing. We see another example of this happening right now, today, in front of all of our eyes. Muslims embarrassed about the fact that Muhammad married a prepubescent child who was unable to consent to marriage, and then had sex with that child when she had precocious puberty, which is a malfunction of the human body, and had sex with a child unable to bear children, who was made infertile because of his actions, have now, today, in our time, started to say that the Hadiths that tell the story can't be trusted. And so, Muslim doctrine and Muslim beliefs in Hadiths are always modulated by the pressure that the Muslim community feels. Right now, Prince Solomon of Saudi Arabia, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, has taken virtually all the Hadiths and kicked them in the bin because he wants to liberalize Saudi Arabia. And he is arguing that most Hadiths can't be trusted. There are entire groups of Muslims called Quranists who have chucked the Hadiths in the bin. Now, the historical method used by the West values things like the criterion of embarrassment. So, for example, when the Gospel said that a woman testified about the resurrection, in those days that would have been an embarrassing testimony, because women were considered unreliable witnesses in those days. But for Christians, we did not have those values. So we pinned the resurrection to the testimony of the women and the empty tomb and then the apostles. And so the criterion of embarrassment is a criterion used by Western historiographers, because religions don't make up embarrassing stories about their leaders. Yes? So they tell good stories about their leaders, not bad stories about their leaders. And that's why if a story is embarrassing in the context that it was made, it would be considered embarrassing, and thus more likely to be true. Also, in Western historiography, we favour falsification. Falsification means that if there's outside evidence that falsifies a claim that will be based upon a reasonable bias, there is a reason to distrust the reasonable bias. Furthermore, Western historiographers look for earliest sources and independent sources. Firstly, Islamic Hadith literature is not early. And even if the stories were secured in an isnad chain, most Sunni Hadiths rely on the same 6 people that were all in bed with one another. And so They were all in the same place at the same time in communication with one another. Whereas the gospel writers were at the same time writing in different places. Furthermore, we also have Pauline literature, Lucian literature, Mark literature, and then literature outside of the Bible by people like Suetonius and Josephus and Celsus and others like the Church Fathers, like Clement of Rome, that all talk independently about the same events, like the crucifixion. Furthermore, in the Hadith literature, we have evidence of corruption. For example, there are synoptic Hadiths that contradict one another about particular facts. These synoptic Hadiths only come to light because they exist, and thus the scholars assess the contradiction and then say, we believe this version, not that version. But they're only aware of them because of the contradiction. That means that it is quite possible that fake hadiths entered into the corpus that are not contradicted by other contradictory hadiths. In other words, errors in the hadith literature that have no contradiction, and so their fakeness can never be questioned. They're standalone reports. Furthermore, there's clear fabrication and fictional stories in the hadiths, such as the fact that the hadiths give a report about a Roman emperor and private correspondence of a Roman emperor and a private meeting of a Roman emperor without any possibility that any of the people who heard that report could have had access to either the meeting or the correspondence. In other words, it was propaganda made up to dishearten Byzantine Christians who were at war and occupied by Muslim forces. Furthermore, there are hadiths that directly contradict the Quran. The Quran is the only 7th century Muslim document that we have. There is no 7th century Muslim document of the hadith. But there are hadiths that contradict the Quran. The Quran says Muhammad will not perform any miracle, and that his only miracle is the Quran itself. But the hadiths report miracles of Muhammad. Why do you think that was? I'll tell you why. Because when the Muslims conquered and occupied and began to Arabize Christian populations in the Middle East, the first thing that the Christians said was, what miracles did your prophet perform to show that he was from God? And the Muslims opened up their Quran and found nothing. And so they started to make up stories about miracles to show that Muhammad was a prophet from God. And for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, every Muslim, God's miracles can be found in the Gospels as performed by Jesus Christ. They can be found in the Old Testament record as performed by his prophets. Muhammad was a false prophet. Now, another reason why Muslims can abandon the belief in the hadith. Muslims have codified the collections like Bukhari and Muslim with quasi-canonical authority, which means that there is an internal pressure amongst Muslims not to evaluate these texts through the historical method. By fixing them as canonical authorities, it suppresses debate about their reliability and evaluation of their historical accuracy amongst the Muslim community. I want to point out that all the major hadith reports were written centuries too late, outside of the Arabian Peninsula, by people who never ever met Muhammad. That's roughly akin to me writing a biography of Charlemagne today, using only oral reports and telling you, believe me bro, I heard it from good people. Any questions on that point before I move on to my next point? Yeah, go on.
When you talk about Islamic methodology, are you talking about tradition or principle? Second question, sorry. Western methodology is scientific methodology, while religious are irrational. So then same logic is applied to Hadith and the Bible.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, guys, if you two want to debate, you want to take it over there. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. This presentation has been brought about because a famous Muslim scholar, Dr. Yasir Qadhi of America, has said that according to the Western historical method, Hadith literature and Sirat literature would not pass the test of the Western historical method. That's quite a statement. It's essentially saying that according to the Western historical method, Muslim sources can't be trusted. And I'm explaining why they can't be trusted from the Western historical method. But, ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear before anyone accuses me of bias. The Western historical method was invented by people who wanted to attack Christianity. They were not friends of Christianity. I am not using a method built by Christians to attack non-Christians, but built by deists and atheists to attack Christianity. But when you use that historical method and apply it to the life of Jesus and the life of Muhammad, the life of Jesus is considered much more reliable than the life of Muhammad. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, Western historians, when they want to know about Jesus, they will go to the Gospels. Western historians, when they want to know about Muhammad's life, say, this is what Muslims tell us, not what we can believe from this hadith literature, because it does not pass the test of Western historiography. You had a question.
We had outside historic facts that have been recorded. Are there any that record facts and miracles from the Hadiths?
I want to be clear. There is virtually zero support for the main claims of Islam. Virtually zero support that Mecca was a 7th century established settlement. Virtually zero support for the claim that Muhammad was a prophet that did any of the things claimed about him in the hadith literature. But, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to Jesus Christ, we have extra biblical support that he was a teacher, that he was called the Messiah, that he had Gentile and Jewish followers, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that he was worshipped as a god. These are all the essential claims of the Christian faith. And so, by the historical method, Christianity stands tall as Islam's hadiths fall and fall and fall. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
But where did they get the idea that now, apparently, Aisha is between the ages of 19 and 21?
Right. This goes to an example that I mentioned earlier. The hadith state that Muhammad married a child 6 years old who could not consent to that marriage, and then consummated that child marriage when she was 9 years old because she suffered from a condition called precocious puberty. In other words, it was child rape to a man who did not know any better. In other words, Muhammad was just as ignorant as a medieval Christian king who also might have married a child. Not exactly the behavior of someone with a direct line to God who told him not to eat pork but didn't bother to tell him about precocious puberty. Now, Muslims are embarrassed by this these days because it means that they are forced to defend child marriage. And some good Muslims who don't want to do that have started to reinvent and to rework the Islamic hadith tradition to say that Aisha was older, that she's more 18 years old or 19 years old. And they're doing it, ladies and gentlemen, because over the centuries of Islam, Islam has sifted its material sources to agree with whatever they needed to agree with at the time, depending upon their sect. Any other questions on the topic?
Bob, you just implied that Aisha had suffered from precocious puberty, meaning that she actually was still technically pubescent. But the scholars actually say that she wasn't pubescent, that she was still a minor. For example, I just debated a Muslim who proved to him that Al-Shafi, for example, accepted she was a minor, a prepubescent minor, which in Islam, if you're pubescent, you are an adult. And if you're prepubescent, you're a child. And he says very clearly she is a child. There's other scholars that I can quote. So just
What's your question?
Sorry, I was just picking up on a little detail there just to say that.
Right, let's be
There's no
clear.
evidence that she was.
Let's be clear. I have a book in my bag from the Shafi Madhab that states in black and white that marriage of prepubescent children is permitted under Sharia law. Right? And so there are Muslims who are saying, yes, Muhammad married someone who was pubescent and that's fine. But the logic, ladies and gentlemen, that says because you bleed you're an adult is an ignorant, backward logic. We have studied the growth of children, and I am sorry that just because a 13-year-old bleeds, it does not make them an adult. And anyone who says so, whether they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim or atheist, you are ignorant and backward in your opinions. Go and read a book. The hips have not widened. The frontal lobes have not yet fully developed for long-sighted decisions. The body chemistry is still in complete chaos. The fossilization of the bones has not yet fully completed. These are the definitions of a biological adult. And so, just because you bleed does not equal that you can breed. Right, any other questions on the topic?
When I did a search, it shows that the average age of pregnancy throughout 30,000 years has been 24. And that the average life in 30,000 years ago was around 30.
Right.
Yeah? So it would have been known in those times that, but much like we know now, that it's 4 times,
Peace be here, go, sister.
5 times more likely for a girl,
God bless.
an underage girl to die in pregnancy.
Okay,
And 4 times
Okay.
more likely in those
thank you.
times.
All right, I get your point. I get your point. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to do it right now. Do it right now. Please, I'm asking you, do it right now. Just Google what is the average global birth age. Do it right now. Google what is the average age for birth. Bro, sorry, yeah. Sir. Yep. Has anyone done it? 30.9 years is the average age of birth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's probably pulled up by the fact that in the West, we're not having children. And we're having children too late. I want to give this advice to all women. Have children before you are 30. Seriously. Fertility drops from 35 onwards like a brick. If you want to have children, have them before you are 30. But, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the average natural birth rate of all communities, all civilizations, all religions works out at 30 demonstrates how Muhammad was wrong to have sex with a 9-year-old child. There is a reason why we wait for children to be older before we penetrate them. Any other questions on the topic of the Hadith? Going once? Going twice? Going 3 times. I love your flag, by the way.